One. Hello, Salt Sprung Nation. Joe Simons like diamonds. We are back again, bringing on a guest who's been here before. Back by popular demand, Travis Thompson, Captain Travis Thompson. What's up, brother?
Hey, buddy, how are you?
I'm doing great. We've had a lot going on this year, 2023, with conservation, and we're going to talk about pelicans and Skyway, talk about maybe manatees and hunting, because I know you're into both hunting and fishing, and there's some new bills coming out on water, and there's so many things that we all want to point to science. And you and I have talked offline before about this. There's so many things that can't really be applied to science, and that's where you have a little bit of social science. And you and I have both read some similar books about that, where sometimes the winner of a certain decision, it's not necessarily the scientist or even the people with the most support. It's sometimes the loudest voices that sometimes get their way, and sometimes don't. It's really it's fascinating, right? How social science works and all this. So I want to do a podcast on it, because I'm willing to bet most people don't know what goes on behind the scene, or behind the doors, or closed doors, or open doors, whatever it is. And you in particular, this is what I love about you. And I always reach out to Travis anytime someone asks me a question about new policies or new bills or whatever it is, because you actually attend these meetings probably more than anyone I know. So you're hearing what's happening on both sides, and you probably have a little bit more intel and insight into what a lot of these different bills and initiatives and closures, et cetera, are doing currently, and could possibly do to harm or help in the long term. So pumped to have you back. I know it was a long intro, but welcome back, brother.
Thanks for having me back, man. And yeah, I think the term we use is social science. Like, how does the social science pressure apply into the world of conservation that we work in? And you've had me on before, and we talked about landscape conservation the first time I was on, and which is kind of the broad spectrum of how does a fisheries regulation relate to land conservation? How does water quality relate to, development? How does this hunting regulation over here connect to someone that maybe just appreciates birds? And so it's all interconnected, and we try to look at what we say is the whole board, and look at the broader spectrum of conservation, and figure out how it's all tied together. And the other kind of side of that is we've never shied away from hard conversations. And I think I wrote a caveat in my notes. I said, if we ever get to where we can't have these discussions because we're scared of the outfall of some of the hard discussions, yep, well, then we've lost as a society. Like, we've got to be willing to kind of come to the table. And I changed my mind on stuff. I've been known to change my mind, and I've actually eaten crow in front of some pretty big crowds before over changing my mind, because I got new information, and that's, yep, nothing to be ashamed about, right? Like, that's how we should all be. That's how we were kind of all raised, is you live and you learn, and you evolve kind of as a human being.
I love it. Let's first define science versus social science. Science is, you've got marine biologists, assuming we're talking about the water, et cetera. You've got real people testing. There's real data to prove one way or another. It's not just theories or emotions. That's science for the most part.
Yeah, the term we see most often used is ecological science or biological science. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what you just described. It's typically the term we love to throw around is peer reviewed. We like to see peer reviewed science. Okay. That's your empirical science that, you're a doctorate student or whatever, and a doctoral student, and you do research on turkeys. And then when you're done with your paper, you actually submit it to a committee that maybe are at other universities around the country, or they may not even be at a university. They may be at an organization or something, but some assemblage of a committee will review that and kind of mark it up or not mark it up or whatever. And then at some point it's published as a peer-reviewed published paper. And that tends to carry a lot of weight in the world we live in. And that's, when we talk about science, that's really ultimately kind of the goal of what we're talking about, is what's the science say?
Got it. So what's social science then?
Social science is kind of everything else. I think if you pulled up the Wikipedia article, you'd have economics, you'd have political science, you'd have just polling data, anything that's not in that science bucket that is a way of measuring data, qualitative or quantitative, could fall into that social science kind of bucket. And it's funny. I used to be a guy here. I changed my mind. I used to be a guy that says, man, I'm really just not a fan of social science. And that's like saying you're not a fan of, I don't even know. It exists. It's not a
Yep.
thing you get to believe in or not believe in. It exists. And so it's more of, I don't understand social science is what I was actually saying. And over time, I've sat down and talked with some people. FWC or FWRI has an incredible social science team, and really smart people that take what we call the human dimensions and apply it to wildlife management, wildlife policy.
What one that we talked about offline, just to give you, and this maybe is a little bit far-fetched example, but the cardinal, right? Talk about that in terms of the
Yeah,
cardinal and hunting. And
so I do conservation work with all Florida, but in my day job, the thing where I usually make money is I run a waterfowl hunting operation. And um, I've always kind of made this argument, like, we want science to drive policy. We want science to drive policy. We want science to drive policy. And a friend of mine, a mentor of mine who used to work for FWC years ago, said, social science is going to drive some of this policy. And I said, what do you mean? And he gave me the example of a cardinal. And he said, how many cardinals exist? And I said, I don't have any idea. He goes, why don't you hunt them? I said, because they're pretty red birds. He said, that's social science. You know, there's a social appetite for hunting a mallard duck or a mottled duck or a teal. And maybe that's generationally passed along. Maybe 200 years ago, people did hunt cardinals for food around their house, and there weren't many of them. And please don't hear that I'm advocating for hunting cardinals at all. I'm just using that as kind of a silly throwaway example of, you have protections in place on cardinals. We don't really do the kind of population surveys on those that we do on ducks or on doves or on other snipe or other game birds. Both are small birds. I would imagine they probably taste pretty similar because they fly around all day. But socially, we have reasons that we don't ever advocate for hunting a bird like a cardinal. And so social science exists in everything. Social science it exists in bag limits. Let's say the state of Florida, and I know this is another regulation. Let's say the state of Florida allowed for taking 2 redfish a day. Theoretically, you could increase the amount of people that could keep a fish by reducing it to 1. You still take the same number of fish, but you would double who could touch it. That's an argument that's made on the turkey side a lot. You know, you can take 2 turkeys when you get a turkey permit in Florida in most places. If you cut that in half, you could have more people that could touch the resource. But then is it worth their effort to put in the time, energy, and effort for turkey hunting to only take 1, because it's, you know, an expensive hobby, and you're not doing it just for the meat, but that is a big part of the reason we hunt and fish. It's called consumptive use. So social science creeps into all this stuff. We just tend not to recognize it on the front.
that's good. There's one that happened recently that in our area in particular, in Tampa Bay and the Skyway Bridge, and there were some new rules in place if you want to fish the bridge. And what I saw, and I'm sure you saw it as well, is anglers in particular, were up in arms on social media. You know, this is baloney, and you know, this is horrible. And what I think most of them don't know is that it was really close to being shut down altogether. Like, this was an actual pretty good meet in the middle, but because most recreational anglers did not show up to any of these meetings, it wasn't just one meeting. This has been going on for a long time. And you had one pretty small group, you know, the pelican people, the bird lovers, whatever you want to call them, they're pretty small in comparison. I mean, they're really small in comparison. And yet they were really loud, and they showed up in force. And there is no true science. Obviously, no one wants to see a pelican die. And they had some pretty gruesome pictures. I saw some of the slides that were used in kind of their pitch, and it does look horrible. I mean, when you see a pelican that essentially is like hung itself from fishing line, no one wants that. No fisherman wants that. No, we all agree that's bad, but there's no real, I don't think, any real true science on these pelicans and if they're thriving. I think most people would say, I see more pelicans than I've ever seen in my life. But there was a lot of that social science. It was pressure, and it was vivid images that I think changed a lot of this policy. Talk about that, because you were a part of a lot of these, and you were one of the few guys I know, and I know Dylan Hubbard as well, and Justin on our team showed up for some of them as well. But from what I've heard, besides just a few of you, there was no one else really representing the anglers. No one else showed up. So talk about that and how social science played a big role in this the Skyway Bridge deal.
Yeah, so let me get in the weeds just a hair on this, and I should also point out ASA and CCA were right there with us. They're always in the arena, on whatever the thing is. But let me get in the weeds just a little bit on bird mortality really quickly, because this sets the stage for kind of where I started in this conversation. So as I said, I run a waterfowl hunting operation, and in a given year, let's just pick and I'm going to make up these numbers. Let's pick blue-winged teal. You know that there's 2 million blue-winged teal out there, roughly. We do some population dynamics, which is complex math, and I don't do it, like scientists do it. And they come up with the numbers, 2 million. And they know that in a given year, 500,000 are going to die, 500,000. They know that 500,000 roughly are going to die whether you hunt them or not. And so hunting, as it pertains to mortality in blue-winged teal, is what's called compensatory mortality. That means you still have the same loss of the population within the margin of that mortality. If hunting caused another 500,000 blue-winged teal to die, so you have 500,000 that die naturally, and then another 500,000 that die from hunting, that extra 500,000 would be called additive mortality. Okay, so compensatory additive mortality are pretty important questions in the bird world that I live in. And it's how we set migratory bird treaty regulations. Mm-hmm. Pelican follows under migratory bird treaty regulations. So the first question I asked at this conversation is, do we know anything about pelican mortality? Do we know anything about pelican populations? Do we know anything about the dynamics here? Like, what's really happening? Because everyone walks around with a cell phone now. And I agree with you. I hate the optics. I hate it. I hate an animal suffering, period. So I don't want any animal to hang off the side of the Skyway Bridge. But is there some level of data out there that tells us they're dying at the same rate now? It's just everyone's walking around with a cell phone and we're telling a different story. Because, you know, animals get hit on the road all the time. No one's going around documenting that and saying we need to outlaw cars. So in that conversation, it actually came up, you know, game animals and game fish and game, we fund through hunting licenses, fishing licenses, and federal dollars to do research on those species. There's no funding for pelican research. Like, you might could go get a grant through a university here or there. You might could get an Audubon to underwrite it. You might could get a Friends of the Pelicans type group to underwrite it. But fishermen and hunters are not going to fund that study. And we can have a different conversation around that, right, wrong, or indifferent. But I can't sit there and hold you as an agency, FWC or DEP or anyone else, to produce data for free. Like, as a taxpayer, I'm paying you to manage this resource. So you've got to do the best with what you know. And so around the pelican conversation, the thing that always came to question was, the data has holes in it. The data is not right. The data is not right. The science isn't there. The data is not right. I tend to agree with that. I'm, you know, if you had a 1 through 10 number line, I'm on the 7 side of the scale that I agree with that. At the same time, that doesn't mean you don't do anything, because the obligation is to manage that resource. And you can't say, oh, we don't have any data on that resource. And this isn't going to happen with pelicans. We don't have any data on that resource. Let's let them go extinct until we get the right data. Like, that's not proper conservation science. It's not proper conservation management. So FWC has a diligence that they have to do to manage this resource in both, you know, strategic practice when they have the right data, but also a tactical response to what they perceive as some sort of localized crisis, wherein one of the stipulations we adamantly pushed for as the fishing, angling, consumptive use community was, we'd like to collect data over a period of time so that we do know more when we have this conversation again in 2 years. Like, I'm never a restriction guy. At the same time, I recognize some restrictions were coming, and they were coming because the agency had to do something in reaction to what was happening here, social science or not. And where we came down Do I love it? No, I would have liked to seen it as a month less restriction, a month less closure. And I think that would have accounted for the peak in pelican mortality based off the data we saw. But at the same time, it's better than closing a quarter of a mile of the pier. It's better than year-round gear restrictions. It's better than nighttime gear restrictions or daytime gear restrictions or any of the other stuff that was kind of proposed out there. And so it was a compromise. I think that's going to have to be the way forward on some of these issues, particularly when we don't have good science, and particularly when anglers can't show up and look at things through what I will say is not just a unified lens, but a nuanced lens that takes into account, do you have the science or not? Because if we draw a hard line right there, there's no going forward, there's no going back. That's it. Social science is part of the management of wildlife. Like it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And we've got to figure out how we're going to play in that sandbox if we're going to be successful moving forward.
That's great. And not just to reiterate, any of you listening who still don't know, I mean, they came in, the Friends of the Pelicans and Audubon, I think there's a few other groups that were kind of supporting it, to shut down the whole Skyway completely. No fishing, nothing, just done. And just so we all know, it got close for that happening. So this was a big deal. And so where we are today, it's certainly not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than just the thing being shut down.
And in all of that, FWC was very receptive to the points anglers made. The Skyway is huge for folks with disabilities.
Yep.
It's very accessible. It's huge for subsistence fishermen. It's huge for tourism. So there's an economic, social aspect there. There's a lot of factors at play in that conversation. But the Skyway specifically, you have other factors like it's owned by DOT, it's operated by DEP, neither of which have wildlife management authority. FWC is in charge of that. And I think to a person, I actually like Kate McFall. She's the Humane Society lobbyist in Florida. Kate and I would agree 100%. Let's knock down the old span where the pelicans are roosting. Let's put some deterrents out there to keep pelicans away and see if we could come up with some other options. Those aren't part of FWC's purview in rulemaking. They can't go hang deterrents on someone else's bridge. They can't go knock down a span because that's not what a wildlife management agency does. You need DEP, you need DOT, you need some other resources involved in that. So this was a little bit of, we've got to come up with a tactical solution. There's a fire. Let's put the fire out, and then we can build something better that's going to be a longer term problem solved here.
That's interesting. It's always more complicated than it seems.
It's funny as we're talking about this, I thought of another kind of example in it. We changed redfish regulations. I guess probably about a year ago. I can't remember exactly when we finalized it, but we had this conversation for, it felt like years, where we just kept having meetings and symposiums and then meetings and then working groups and then meetings. And every meeting, a small contingent of anglers would come up unhappy with like one thing. This doesn't, the last one, I think, and I forget where it was, but somewhere in the Indian River Lagoon, the boundary marker they were unhappy with. And I pulled a couple of them aside in the lobby at that meeting. I said, look, guys, I get what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying. But if we continue to do this, at the same time, the Indian River Lagoon's guides were asking to close the fishery there. And the fishery closures that were in effect were taking place on an executive order on the other side of the state. There would have had to be an amendment to an executive order, a reissue of an executive order to encompass multiple things. It got very convoluted and complex from a process side to do that. And I'm like, if you'll go in there and support this rule, they'll close that fishery down based off the metrics in this rule. So it's a little bit of like you're cutting your nose off to spite your face. Like, yeah, you continue to fight that, and people are going to continue to take redfish out of this fishery you want closed. And if we don't get it done at this meeting, it's going to be 3 months before we can meet again, and probably 6 months before it gets brought up again. And if it doesn't get done there because you don't like, I don't know, some metric in the water quality thing, nothing's ever going to be perfect. Sometimes we got to get it to a spot where we can land the plane and get off of it, reevaluate it, and come back to it again later. Because none of this stuff's set in stone.
So good. Another one, kind of to pivot away from the pelicans, was Goliath grouper, where I think most of us would also agree there's more than we've ever seen, more than we remember. And talk about kind of what happened there with some social science. And once again, a kind of a smaller group of people showing up louder than anybody else.
Yeah. So again, on Goliath, ASA, CCA, all Florida, for the most part, there were some other stakeholders that would drift in, of one here, one there, and Dylan Hubbard, Florida Guides Association, Hubbard's Marina, those four stayed in that fight for several years. But there were often meetings where we were the only four people saying, hey, we need to open some sort of season on Goliath. And you had 28 dive operators saying, no, you need to keep Goliath closed. To put it in perspective, I was at a meeting where me, Travis Thompson, Gary, Tripp, Dylan are testifying, hey, we need to open Goliath. And on the other side of that conversation, you have names like Guy Harvey and Jacques Cousteau's son, or grandson, like celebrity kind of, we all have Guy Harvey shirts in our closet. Like, I'm not one to disagree with Dr. Guy Harvey very often. So there was a lot of pressure to keep Goliath closed. And so the complaint always heard when we opened the Goliath quota deal, I guess it's been about a year ago, was this slot limit is dumb. We need to be taking the big ones. We need to be doing this. We need to be doing that. And I saw this from a billion people who I'd never saw in a room ever on any of these conversations. And then their complaint was always, well, it's a Thursday. I can't take off and drive across the state on a Thursday. Well, then you don't get to complain about this process, because the dive guys all took off and drove across the state on a Thursday. And the end up of the slot limit really came from a compromise of, we need to get Goliath open, but we also have to appease the dive community to some degree on this. So the slot was a compromise in that situation. And I think you get the season open, you collect data on it, and then you say, okay, we've seen no impacts in the mortality on these fish or the population of these fish. Maybe we can increase the slot from, I think it's at 54 now. Maybe we can increase it to 60. Maybe we increase it to 65. Like, maybe we can go up. But if we never take that first step in that direction, we're never going to get there. And honestly, as soon as we passed to open Goliath season, the dive community came in and said, well, we want to close this set of, I think it was 12 or 13 reefs off the Southeast Florida coast to any fishing. No fishing. Goliath catch and release. I mean, it was in a catch and release zone anyway. No Goliath catch and release, and no catch and take of any other species. And again, FGA, CCA, ASA, AF, we pushed back on that, fought back on that, and eventually won that to keep that open, which again, huge win for the angling community that you won't see on the front page of any paper or anything. Huge win for the angling community, because it keeps a resource open and keeps us moving towards, I'm not a scientist, but in Travis's mind, you should be able to go to the phosphate dock in Boca Grande and take a Goliath grouper off of. You should be able to go to the Sanibel Causeway and take a Goliath grouper off of. I'm not saying all of them, but there should be some managed number of tags out there where you could take those giant fish off, because they do, I think they ruin the fishery, because you can't catch snapper. You can't catch other species there, because the Goliaths eat everything you catch. You can go to any reef near shore and it's like that.
Yep. How big is when he's saying diving, just we're talking about scuba diving, right? And the eco tours and all this stuff that they're doing underwater. How big is, how many scuba divers are even in Florida, America? Do you know?
I have no idea. I'll tell you this though.
I wonder how big that.
This is, I taught Dylan this term a few years ago, and now it's his, so I have to borrow it back from him. But Goliath grouper are what we term charismatic megafauna. We know this in the hunting side or in the wildlife management side. Anytime you have something big, people tend to fall more in love with it. We see it with bears. We see it with sandhill cranes. We see it with
manatees.
Manatees. It's a charismatic animal. Like, you take your kids to the zoo and they see a manatee, and the first words out of their mouth is, "Oh, Daddy, can I pet it?" Like, it's a soft, squishy potato looking thing floating around. I admit it's a cute animal. So Goliath, if you run a dive operation in Southeast Florida, you could run, I don't know, 5 dive trips a day with 20 divers a trip, and they go out and they can't feed them, but they can go out and pet a Goliath grouper, and you're petting this 400-pound fish under, I don't know if they can pet them legally or not. You're interacting with this fish underwater that is a uniquely incredible specimen. Like, we've all caught them and we know they're uniquely credible. They're cool fish. I don't want to take that away from those folks either. There's an economic driver on that side of the street as well, though. When you look at the amount of money that the dive industry brings into Southeast Florida, that's a significant part of social science in that conversation as
Mhm.
well. So it's just really not as cut and dry as, man, I can't fish that wreck anymore because there's a Goliath sitting on it that just keeps eating all of my fish. It's way more nuanced, way broader, and way more complex than a simple, well, we should just get rid of it.
Yeah, so 2.5 million people participated in scuba diving in the US last
Okay.
year,
How
compared
about
to 55 million anglers.
the other side of that would be, what's the economic impact, and what does that stratify? Because I'm sure the dive industry is not much worth much in Des Moines, Iowa. So
Yeah.
that
Yep.
2.5 million is probably very much isolated to the coast and probably California and Florida.
Yeah.
And so you could have a significant economic impact there. But, it's something we talk about a lot, is the idea of hunters and fishers, anglers as conservationists, and our dollar match that comes back from the feds. And there's no licensing attached to that on the diving side that actually does a contributory dollar amount, which in Florida goes really heavily to our artificial reefs program.
Mhm.
So the FWC does an incredible artificial reefs program, and anglers actually ultimately pay for that. So that was some of the leverage that we used in that, keeping that Goliath spawning site open for fishery. And there was almost no measurable mortality there. It's not like you could see like a Western dry rocks where there was a huge drop in the permit spawning if you had it open for fishing during the spawning season.
Yeah.
This was, we think it might have some impact. We don't really think it's much at the best. Like it might go from 4% to 5%. Very, very negligible. So that was a big win for anglers, but it took a lot of finagling around the social science situation, because we couldn't just point at, oh, there's plenty of Goliath grouper because the science says so now.
How popular was that that tag, I guess is the right term? Like, how many people do you know?
I never followed back up on that. I was determined I was going to apply to get one just out of spite, because there was so much pushback on it. And
There
I was like,
was.
the agency has really had our back on this entire conversation. And I put it in perspective. I said, you got a species that was listed by the IUCN in 2017, 18, something like that, as being critically endangered, and we just opened up a harvest on it in 2022.
That's wild.
That's a huge movement for the state. And honestly, took a lot of guts for the state to do that. And in the face of the public pressure that included some luminary type names, man, I wanted to buy the tag just to be supportive of the agency. I don't think I have ever caught a Goliath that would fall in that slot. I've caught a ton that would be under it and a ton that would be over it.
Yep.
I don't think I've ever caught one that falls within that slot.
Yeah, that was pretty funny. Cool. Any other examples or things you want to share? Because I one thing I want to especially talk about here is the importance of showing up to some of these meetings, and maybe kind of talk about that and how often they're happening. How can people participate and be a voice? Because that all ties into the social science piece of it.
Yeah, I say it a lot that the biggest struggle our state faces is not growth or development or water issues or anything else. It's apathy.
Hmm.
And we could go way into the weeds on like invisible hand economics and Adam Smith and how that's all changed historically. But the simple fact is, we simply want that resource to exist for our benefit oftentimes. And I've been that guy before.
Yeah.
I want to work all week, and on Saturday morning, I want to get in my boat and I want to go catch, whether you're a catch and release guy or a catch and keep guy, I want to go catch a mess of snapper to eat, or I want to go catch a bunch of redfish to turn loose or whatever. I just want to go in, I want to go impact that resource, but I don't think of it as impacting that resource. I think it's there for me to use. And I think apathy is the thing that kills us. And I think we have a responsibility as citizens. Well, I'll get myself in trouble here, but I used to say a lot, hunters are conservationists. I've given that talk. I wrote a post about this the other day on social media, but I've given that talk in schools, at colleges, at high schools, at church groups, you name it. I'll come talk to you about sportsmen as conservationists and conservation dollars and funding and how it works. I think that time has passed where we get to rest on our laurels and just say, well, we do that by buying a license. Because yes, there are some federal funds, like I just mentioned, that come out of that on both sides of that that coin, the hunting and fishing side. But we have to learn to engage with these resources if we want to be conservationists. And I will say that's a place where the environmental community kicks our butts. Because when you listen to the environmental community talk, these people are consumed with whatever the things are they love. They understand it and they love it, and they've like indoctrinated it into themselves. And that's the thing that I try to do. The things I love, I try to put inside me so that, not to be reductive to religion, but it's kind of like reading your Bible. I've heard you guys talk about that stuff. Like you put it inside you and you have it. I kind of feel that same way about the ideas of conservation. Like you need to kind of ingest some of that and make it part of your core, your core set of values. You need to develop your own conservation ethic. And we tend to, you and I had a conversation offline about something else where it was a bill or something, and people had not read it. I see that a lot. We react to what we see on social media. And so we see a headline. And I'll pick one that's really controversial that I get a lot of trouble about. It's the idea of spraying. We see a lot of people yell about spraying because on paper, spraying seems really bad. Now, the irony in all this is spraying has the high road on the science side. Like they've got reams and reams and reams of science and
you're, just to be clear, you're talking about spraying in lakes for hydrilla and
hydrilla or hyacinth or whatever. It becomes a very convoluted topic because people see, well, do you want them to poison our waters? And that's not as simple as that conversation. It's a very nuanced conversation. And if you let a plant like a hyacinth go loose in a lake, it tends to double in growth about every 7 days. And it's a floating invasive plant, which means nothing grows underneath it because sunlight is required for growth. So it blocks it out. If it doubles every 7 days, that means on a lake like Okeechobee, let's say, if it were to fully cover in hyacinth, a week before it was fully covered, it would be half covered, which would be about 200,000 acres. And then suddenly it would have 440,000 acres. And then suddenly you have nothing growing underneath it. You have no eelgrass, you have no hydrilla, you have no pondweed, you have none of these native plants that we want that are ecologically we need. And I'm not saying spraying's the be all end all, but I am saying every time we say we can't spray because I don't like spraying, it becomes problematic to actually impact our wildlife and our ecology in a way that maybe isn't as cut and dry. And I've gone to bat fighting against spraying on various lakes. But it's not so much the herbicide is the evil. It's more of, I want to leave some of this hydrilla or some of this plant over here. I don't want to impact that area because of the bass or the ducks or the fish or whatever. And so it becomes a really nuanced conversation out there that on social media world, we don't know that much about. And I can go do podcast after podcast after podcast, lining up scientists and experts on this. And I've actually gotten hate mail from doing some of those, because why would you talk to those people? They're the enemy. And like I said, kind of earlier in this conversation, if we're not having these discussions, man, what are we even doing? Like, what are we even talking about? Yeah. I think that's a hard conversation to have. But there's some lakes where I actually wish they could spray more frequently, and you would see more spray boats out there. But by doing so, they could leave more plants, because to do it in a maintenance mode, it's like mowing your yard, right? You have to mow it every week. Well, if you could simply mow these paths, you could let your yard go wild so that you could walk around in it. That's really a win for me, because then your bass guys could get around, your pleasure boaters could get around, your flood control could work, and we'd still have really good habitat for birds and wildlife. So it's just I like to say conservation isn't convenient. It's not. And oftentimes we think, because I'm one of these guys, I'm going to show up at this meeting, I'm going to change the world by showing up at this meeting. That's not really what's going to happen. What you got to do is be willing to show up and have some conversations and have some talks with some of these scientists, some of these folks, and share your opinion. Share what you see in a respectful manner. Like we've kind of lost kindness as a society, but share what you've seen and share what you think, and listen. Talk, then listen, and develop relationships with some of these people. And I guarantee it would open your eyes and change your views on some of the stuff you see kind of floating around there in the world. It's really not as cut and dry as we think. It's way more nuanced than we think. And it requires a lot more hands on deck to kind of change the story and change the narrative to get it to where we can improve our wildlife management or our water quality or our land conservation or whatever to benefit all of us as Floridians.
I love it, man. Powerful stuff, dude. This is one of my favorite ones. I've no, it's just so good. The very last podcast, I talked a lot about what I read in my month off and about conservation. That was kind of one of the promises. We're going to just do more and more of these, and you nailed it at the end. So much of this it's never as cut and dry as we think it is, and there are all kinds of social influences, and there's money, and there's power, and there's all kinds of stuff in play. It's never just a simple cut and dry deal, but it takes a lot of us, anglers in particular, if we want to protect what we have, we got to get involved. We need to understand what we're talking about as well, and we got to show up. I mean, it's wild what has happened over the last 50 years on all kinds of fronts when just a group of people, like you said, who are passionate, regardless of what they're talking about, if they're passionate about it and they're all in and it's part of them, they show up in droves. And it's amazing what can get done if you got enough passionate people who are truly involved and understand what they're talking about. So I appreciate you. Yeah, I appreciate you.
One of my favorite quotes, the Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of people can change the world because it's the only thing it ever has.
Yeah, so true. Yep. So I appreciate you big time for showing up and just being consistent and being full of fun information. This is great. I'm willing to bet a lot of people on this podcast learned a lot, and I want to hear from you guys, and I'm sure Travis does as well. We always put this will be on YouTube. So if you're watching here, go back to the saltstrong.com page, and below the actual video, there's a place to put a comment that'll come right to me. I could forward to Travis if it's a question you guys have, or if you want him back again, which I know a lot of you probably do. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And where can they reach you for guides or for hunting, fishing?
Yeah, very quickly, at Travis Thompson, at Duck Ranchin with no G if you want to hunt, and at all FLA ORG is our nonprofit, All Florida. So those are my three. You can find me at any of those three places.
Cool. Brother, you nailed it. This is awesome.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe. I appreciate it.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, guys. Make sure to join the Insider Club if you haven't already. You got some really neat things that we are rolling out here in the second half of the year. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to you on the next episode.